And this is one again where because of where we're having the conference that we get to talk a little bit about, which is session 2 and rural safety and how it's different than urban safety, and which is my bad joke about why did the bison cross the road? Because someone built the road in the middle of its habitat. So, you know, wildlife on and near our roadways is just one safety issue that we deal with primarily in rural areas. This is a couple of bighorn sheep actually here on Montana 64. And the animals don't necessarily have to be on the roadway. You get people stopping to take pictures. You know, we're near Yellowstone National Park, and you'll hear the rangers talk about, it seems like when people are on vacation, common sense sometimes goes out the window, which means like, hey, I might be in the middle of a driving lane that's posted 45, but I see a critter on the side of the road, so I'll hit the brakes, stop and take a picture, and things don't always go so well. So as we talk about the challenges of safety in rural areas, we have a great panel to make those discussions. We'll start with Jamie Sullivan. I'm proud to be a co-worker of Jamie's. Jamie is the director of the National Center for Rural Road Safety and is a senior research engineer here at the Western Transportation Institute. After Jamie, we'll hear from Hillary Icebrands, who is the FHWA Resource Center Director for Safety and Design Technical Services. And then Rob Amanta, another co-worker who will talk about road ecology and dealing with animal vehicle collisions. So with that, we'll start with Jamie. So on the clicker if you want.
I'm going to check the time first just to make sure that I don't go over. So thank you all for having me today. I'm excited to be here and talk to you a little bit. I'm going to start with talking a little bit about the National Center for Rural Road Safety that David just mentioned. We are a Federal Highway Administration Center of Excellence. We've been around since December of 2014. And the center just recently went up for recompetition, very much like you all are going to do for the UTC here shortly. And the new operations for that new competition started February 1st of 2022. So just within the last couple of months. With our recompetition, some of the things that we did was creating an updated management team. And some new partners as well. So I retained being the director of it, but we've added some management levels underneath me. We added a marketing and communications manager, who I hope that some of you will be hearing from very shortly, Kevin Elliott from ARA. We've added a new operations manager, Cameron Ishak. You heard him mentioned in the last presentations as well about doing some of the tribal work. And then we have added a training manager who is Janet Laley from Rutgers, and Kate, who is represented in this room as well. And so these are some of our new partners that we've added too. You'll see some familiar universities on the list, but really I want to focus on what we do and who we are, and how we can partner with you. David talked a lot about those partnerships. So what we do is rural safety all the time. It's really where our bread and butter lies. We talk about it, we create resources for it, we do training and workforce development for it. And really we're focusing on local practitioners and trying to get implementable, actionable information to those local practitioners and what they can do to improve rural safety. And we do this through creating resources such as a local road safety plan handbook that we just did. We've done different videos on trainings, and we do technical assistance as well. And we've also created a multidisciplinary training safety certificate for local practitioners. And that multidisciplinary piece means that it's not just for the planners and engineers, but also for the maintenance and operations staff, for public health staff, and for first responders. And so really trying to break down some of those silos and making sure that everyone is thinking safety and they're all doing it on an equal footing. And we'll talk a little bit about that here in a second too. And lastly, we try and keep up national connections. I'm usually the one in the room yelling, please don't forget rural, please make sure you give funding to rural, please do rural research. And so you guys are all going to get that benefit today of me standing up here saying, please do rural. But most importantly, on the collaboration side, when David was talking earlier about trying to get some of the research that you guys are doing out into the hands of practitioners and really making sure that it gets put into practice, that's one of the places that we can collaborate together. So I'd like to offer that to you. Some of the things that we do is a monthly webinar series where we talk about a lot of different topics, and we love to pull in people who have done implementable research that really needs to get into the hand of practitioners. So please feel free to reach out if you have that type of information that you'd like to get out. We post a lot of information on our social media. You can find us on Facebook and Twitter at Rural Road Safety. On LinkedIn, you can find us at National Center for Rural Road Safety. But again, if you've got research and reports and guidebooks that are coming out, we'd love to highlight those for you if they relate to rural safety. We also have a Safety Sidekick newsletter, a newsroom on our website that we post a lot of these resources to. We do training e-blasts, so if you're having your own conferences or having your own webinars, we'd love to highlight those as well. We pull information about conferences, safety awareness weeks, and webinars and in-person trainings and put them all into one email every 2 weeks and send it out to all of our practitioners and our others who subscribe to our distribution list to let them know what's upcoming, not just from us, but from everybody that they could potentially be interested in, so they don't have to go search all of that out. And then we also hold Rural Road Safety Awareness Week, and I've talked to a couple of you in the audience about this already, but this will be held July 18th through the 22nd of this year. We'd love to have you all participate, share the information. If you've got resources that make sense to fit with some of our themes, we'd love to highlight those as well. You can find more information on our website at ruralsafetycenter.org, but our main theme is taking action, saving lives this year. And it's focused on local practitioners, and we will be rolling out a new website, a brand new website to go with that week as well, and highlighting all of the daily themes. So with that, I'm going to get more into rural and safety. And so many of you probably are thinking, well, I don't work for a UTC that does rural, or I don't work for a UTC that does safety. So why is it important that I listen to a session like this? And really it's that we wanted to help increase your knowledge on rural safety together, but also separately, and then encourage you that as you're doing your research, it's really important to put a lens of rural and a lens of safety. And as you just heard in the last session, a lens of tribal on all of the research that gets done. Many times those three topics get forgotten and aren't really put into what research is coming out. And many of the results tend to be very urban focused. And so I hope that by the end of our presentations today, you can think about how when you put results out, you might be able to put out some results or recommendations that have that flair of how could a rural practitioner or a safety practitioner or a tribal practitioner use the research that I just put out, and how might it be different, those recommendations, if I look at it through those lenses. So the impact of safety, Nathan talked about this a little bit, but I wanna show this to you as well, is that over 36,000 people, or there were over 36,000 fatalities on the road in 2019. And if we break that down a little bit more, it comes out to a little bit less than 100 roadway fatalities per day. And most importantly, if we look at it right now, in the hour and a half that we're gonna be sitting here talking about this topic, it's 6 people. So 6 people will die on a roadway as we're sitting here. And it's important to know that those numbers that we're talking about are people, right? And Nathan mentioned that when he asks Hillary, her answer is always 0. We want 0 fatalities because we don't want anyone in our family or anyone in anyone else's family to not make it home that day. It's important that we remember that these people have, they have a name, they have family, they have friends, they're someone's most important person. And why that's important is because safety really is the responsibility of all of us, which Nathan also talked about. Whether you do safety research or not, it's really important all of us use the road, whether we drive an automobile, whether we walk or bike, whether we take transit. all of us in transportation can really affect these numbers and what happens in safety. And so one of the ways we can do this is by moving away from a traditional safety outlook on transportation and moving towards the safe system approach. And again, you can all implement this into your research that you're doing. The important part about the safe system approach is that there are 6 principles and 5 elements of it. And the 6 principles around the outside. And they talk about the fact that death and injury is unacceptable, which is what we just showed. We really want to get that number to 0. It's not okay for anyone to die. We want everyone to get home when they get out on the roadway and are going somewhere. But an important piece of that is that humans make mistakes. And we also heard Nathan talk about that when he showed, and that we're human and that there are pieces that are involved in that. And so we need to be able to work for that and design for that and plan for those mistakes. And in doing that, we can be proactive in our safety work, and we can also have redundancies, which make sure that if one mistake is made, that there are other things that can catch us from not having that repercussion of a fatality if we do make that one mistake while we're on the roadway. We also know that humans are vulnerable. So in the last presentation, you also heard a lot about speed. So speed is a key factor in this vulnerability. And as the speeds go up and you have a crash, your likelihood of a fatality or a serious injury also goes up. And so it's very important that we take that into account as well. So the safe system approach is different from that traditional approach, which I mentioned, and that's because now we're not trying to the key element of getting people as fast as we can and moving goods as fast as we can. We're really looking at it from an aspect of getting people where they need to be, but doing it safely, regardless of what mode. Traditionally, we've looked at the automobile and the car, and now we're looking at it from all aspects. And the most important part that I mentioned is that responsibility is shared. So it's all of our responsibility, not just those people who are engineering the roads, but also the people who are working on the cars, the people who are using the roadway, whether you're using it in a vehicle, pedestrian, or bicycle, however you may be using it. The five pieces that we look at it from are safe vehicles, safe speeds, safe roads, post-crash care, so how fast you can get to someone and what happens after a crash might occur, and then also safe road users. And each of these pieces has the unique challenges based on rural areas. And so I'm gonna flip over and talk a little bit more about rural so that we can get into some of those pieces. When we compare rural and urban, the top bar you see here is that 19% of the population lives in rural areas as opposed to 81% who lives in urban. We also know that about 68% of the public road miles are in rural areas, so more road miles in rural. However, 30% of vehicle mile travels happen in rural, so there's less travel happening, and 45% of the fatalities. Now that number has gone up and down a little bit. It's usually pretty close with urban, but the most important piece to recognize there is that because there are less people and there's less vehicle miles traveled, the fatality rate in a rural area is twice that of an urban area. So it's important that when we start talking about wanting to get to 0 fatalities and serious injuries, that we don't forget rural, and that we make sure that the research that we're doing when we're taking this into account accounts for some of those unique pieces of rural and tribal lands as well. And so if we take a deeper look at rural, a few things that you could think about is that 44% of rural passenger vehicle traffic is actually urban residents. So if we think about the fact that yesterday Yellowstone closed and we need to evacuate the entire park, what percentage of those people do you think were locals versus probably urban residents that were trying to get out of Yellowstone, right? And they're not familiar with the area. So now where do they go? And do they know the roads that they're going to travel on? Because likely we're putting them on roads that they hadn't planned to be on because now they're evacuating, right? So we always have to think about those pieces too. 47% of all truck vehicle mile travels occurs in rural areas. So that's something else we have to think about when we think about freight movement. When we look at the fatalities and start breaking that down, we can talk about, again, some of those things that Nathan brought up in his presentation too. But 1/3 of all fatalities, no matter where they are rural roadway departures. And then a third of rural fatalities include speed as a factor. 72% of rural fatal crashes occur on roads with speeds greater than 55 miles per hour. We just talked a little bit about why that speed is important when you get into a crash. And 60% of rural pickup occupants that were killed were unrestrained, so not wearing seatbelts. So there are just a few, those are just a few of the statistics that we can take a look at that make rural a little bit different. But so I love showing these pictures to show why all roads aren't the same. There's some differences. Usually we come to a rural area because we love how it looks, right? But with how it looks and those, it also come the differences in the roadway geometry too. So we have a lot more horizontal and vertical curves that we're dealing with. And when we start talking about having the urban people in the rural areas, they may not know how to deal with these roadways quite as often. So making sure that we are making them safe for that too. We also have different terrain and different road conditions that happen. Again, we're seeing all the flooding that's happening here. It happens many times in other rural areas too. One of the examples I was going to give you was Vermont, when they had a hurricane a few years ago and all the rivers flooded. And they had towns that were cut off that they couldn't get to. And now, unfortunately, the same thing is happening here as well. If we take a look at the center picture up at the top, we have different roadway types. So you're going to find unpaved roads more frequently in rural areas. You're going to find more 2-lane roads, more uncontrolled intersections that don't have traffic signals or stop signs. And that's a big consideration to think about in rural areas. Over on the left-hand side, you'll see that very far picture is driving down here on 191. And so there's also different road infrastructure. So the lanes tend to be more narrow. There tends to be a lack of shoulders. There's a bigger chance that there's not a clear zone because there's more trees, or that the shoulder, that there's more ditches that you could run into as well. There's higher speeds as we talked to, and then there's also less lighting to see what is coming up against you as well. Down here, these bottom two, we have a different road user mix typically in rural areas that you have to consider. So you're going to see a lot more agricultural vehicles, a lot more other slow moving types of vehicles like horse and buggies, which also travel more in rural areas. You're going to see more tourists, so more recreational vehicles, more motorcycles. And then when we start talking about some of the Alaska lands, again, Nathan was talking about, you're going to see more off-road vehicles and more snow machines and dog sleds. And so those are things that you do need to also consider for rural. And then we have wildlife out on the road with this bison, and luckily Rob's going to talk to us a little bit more about that. And then again, the tourists with the glacier bus that you can see here. So the same thing when we talk about rural communities, and are they all the same? And again, the answer is no. There's a lot of rural communities that we have to consider, and uniqueness that goes along with each one. So there's exurban areas, which are those ones that are near enough to an urban area that they rely on that urban area for jobs and commerce and shopping. There's the tourism-based ones, such as the one we're in right now, which relies on skiing or the national parks or the forests. There's resource-based ones that rely on the agriculture or the extraction in the area. There's those older age communities, which provide us with some of the challenges that we see with mobility and transit. There's beyond the lower 48. So when we're considering the differences in transportation in Alaska and Hawaii and Puerto Rico, tribal lands and Alaska Natives, which we just heard a lot about in the last panel. And then frontier and remote is typically what people think about when they think about rural, those areas where there's nothing. It's known as rural, but we have all the rest of these that have their challenges too that we have to think about. And so some of those unique challenges that we start thinking about are resources and funding, as we heard again in the last section. There's less people to do the same amount of work. There's the data that there's a lack of is tied to that funding, so there tends to be less funding. Communications and power infrastructure is not as great in rural areas as it is in the urban, and that's going to become a large issue when we start talking a lot more about connected and automated vehicles. And when we think about that number of 44% of vehicle miles traveled from urban areas, when people come here, even just to recreate and do their tourism, they're going to want the same type of movement that they can do and be able to use their connected and automated vehicle if they're driving their personal car. And right now, a lot of that's not going to be able to happen. It just won't be the same as what they have at home. Geographical jurisdictions have a large part to play in rural areas as well, whether that be from the amount of land that they're trying to do maintenance and operation on and having that lack of staff and lack of funding, or whether that be on an enforcement side and how you enforce speeding or seatbelt use in that large of a geographical area when you have fewer sheriffs in order to do that. Or even when you start thinking about that post-crash care is a really important part of safety, and how are we going to be able to get not just notification if power and communications isn't there in a rural area, but how are we going to get that emergency resource from one side of the jurisdiction to where the crash happened and get them there in enough time to be within that golden hour that someone needs them to be there. Natural disasters and climate change. Again, the flooding that's happening right now is a big example of the things that happen here in rural areas. And many times when you start seeing some of these bridges being taken down, that's happening with the flooding right now, when we try to go to replace them, there either may not be the funding to replace them, or if they're only serving a few people, they may not get the priority to be replaced. And that could impact that rural area, such as an agricultural farmer who could have now gotten to medical or shopping in 10 minutes using that bridge. And if they choose not to replace it, now they have this 45-minute hour drive to get to where they need to go and the resources that they need if that doesn't get replaced. Same thing with sustainable options for mobility. It's a lot harder when we start talking about those older age communities or people who are carless, and the equity side of things. When there's less people in an area, it's a lot harder to fund some of these transit options and even other alternative modes that we might use. And behavioral safety and social issues. We see a different mindset sometimes in rural areas as well. The thought that there's not as much traffic, so I can make riskier choices. That enforcement, those geographical jurisdictions are much bigger, so there may not be enforcement. So me going a little bit faster is not a problem, but it is a problem, right? So trying to consider all of those. And so as I wrap up, I just wanted to bring us back to the USDOT research priorities as you all are starting to think about UTC recompetition. So clearly promoting safety, we think we can add that safety and rural lens to it, but we can add that lens to all of the rest of these too. So again, I would encourage you as you're starting to do research projects or think about them to add in that little piece of how can I apply rural tribal safety to what it is I'm looking at. We just talked about examples of mobility of people and goods when on the transit side and the freight side. So when we're doing recommendations there, we can think about how some of those rural challenges could be applied or tribal challenges could be applied to the research that you're doing when you're giving recommendations. Even when we talk about cybersecurity risks, if there is less people and less funding and we're making these recommendations for things that could help for areas, we can think about how those could be different if we're making them for rural and tribal areas. For instance, a dynamic message sign. We've heard a lot in the news about those getting hacked, right? In an urban area, you're going to know it's hacked pretty quickly because you're going to have social media people telling you. You may even drive by it really fast. But what if that happens in a rural area? How long will it take you to figure out that that got hacked and that there's some message that shouldn't be up there? So considering the fact that these rural and tribal areas also need these recommendations, they just might be a little bit different for what they might be. So thank you.
All right, thank you, Jamie. And we have a nice progression here between Jamie, myself, and Rob in terms of starting out higher level. I'm going to get a little bit mid-level, if you will, and then Rob's going to dive into some wildlife challenges and opportunities in the rural areas. So Thank you for having me here. Again, the bios are in the back, but I'm Hillary Eisrens with Federal Highway Administration Resource Center Safety and Design Technical Services team. I happen to be based out of Colorado, so it was a lovely 11-hour drive up here between Sunday and Monday. And always such an honor with the beauty and the being rural. Actually, my entire drive was rural. And so this is, rural is near and dear to my heart. It's where I grew up in northern Wisconsin. It's where my grandparents and great-grandparents farmed to have a living, to really support their family in the Midwest. Ultimately, I lived in a forested area, and then I have the honor of living in the Rocky Mountains of Colorado currently. And so Jamie gave you numerous statistics about, why rural is important, why safety is important. And I really do believe my career actually started in construction and highway design. And it wasn't until I went back to school to get my graduate degrees at Iowa State University that I really transformed my career in terms of being more geared towards safety. We all have a role in safety. I believe that if you touch transportation, if you are a part of a university, if you have an opportunity to work with students and work on research, really our number one priority is safety. And it's getting people home safely. And you heard Nathan mention it, you heard Jamie mention it, and I will mention it. Really that zero is our goal, and it will take all of us to get there. And zero is the goal for our family, and I hope it is for yours. And we really need to think of it that way, because when you looked at the numbers that Jamie put up there, nearly 40,000, and if you look at the preliminary numbers for 2021, we have over 42,000 people that were killed on our roadways. So we were headed in the wrong direction when it comes to folks being killed on our roadways. And so whether it is your specialty is ITS or climate change or structures or infrastructure, there's a lot of different ways that we can integrate safety in rural and think about those aspects of what we're doing as we move forward. David said something right off the bat this morning about implementation. Being shovel ready, I remember was the term when I went back to school. My research, my graduate research and doctorate research was shovel ready. And so that is really an important piece that we need to remember. And that's why I'll talk about the resources that I brought up here. We've got to get this information to every practitioner, every part of our country in terms of how we can deploy proven countermeasures, proven strategies and solutions. So I'm going to talk, go a little bit deeper into understanding rural, and I'm actually going to tap into some of national databases that we have that help us maybe better describe rural and the difference between what might be urban and what might be rural. And then I'm also going to talk about some of those important solutions that we can look for as we have our conversations and collaborate and coordinate with each other. So the Environmental Protection Agency has an environmental justice screening tool, EJ Screen. I don't know if you all are familiar with it. It's an amazing database. Again, it is a national database. And what I have pulled up here is really looking at population density. So we are in Montana. You can find Montana up there. You can see that the lighter colors really mean there's less population. So it's spread across the region, the state, the area more broadly than our urban areas that you can see there in the darker colors. So this is a snapshot. Clearly, what we show here, it's in the integrity of the data. And we should not forget about the access to data, which is really important, but also the accuracy. And I'm going to talk a little bit about what it might look like when we look at the map of the United States versus the map of a state versus the map of a county or a township or tribal lands, and how that actually can look different when you look at it from a broader level versus a more specific level, and how important that is to all of us when we are making decisions, when we are looking at research and we're ultimately deploying something that might work in a particular area. If you've not dabbled in this tool, I encourage you to do so. There's information about equity, there's information about pollutants, about population, and overlaying different data sets is, I think, one of the most powerful things that we can do when we have something that we're really looking for. And so I'm going to give some more examples of that. This is from USDA, US Department of Agriculture. This is the rural urban continuum map. This is data from 2013. And this is specifically looking at the Atlas of Rural and Small Town America. So again, now what we see here is percent of civilian labor force 16 and older that's employed in the agriculture, forestry, fishing, and hunting. So now we're looking at not only, what the land looks like, but we're also looking at specifics in terms of, again, those topics up there. Really important, and it helps us it's really surrogates for rural. There's a lot of different, sometimes people, it's like, I need to see it. If I see it, I know it's rural. Some people are like, oh, well, what's the land use? What's going on there? Is it a desert? Is it a forest? Is it farmland? Those all can be surrogates to help us really understand, again, what rural is, and then how we can help rural achieve its goals across the board. So again, another amazing resource and data set. So this is looking at actually the classification. This is that rural to urban continuum I talked about that USDA is using. And if you look over there to the right, the very dark blue is metropolitan, so 1 million or more people. And then if you go all the way to the bottom, it says completely rural and not even adjacent to something that might look more populated. So, this is in line, probably what we know about the United States. You can pick out your state here and see if that is making sense. And again, at this high level, we're at 30,000 feet here. This is like, yeah, this is a decent representation of what urban versus rural might be. But let me show you an example when we drill down a little bit further. So this happens to be the state of Colorado. It's where I'm currently live over the last 15 years. And if you look here, you can see the Denver, there's going to be the Denver area, there's Fort Collins, there's Boulder, there's Colorado Springs. That's all the dark blue and the darker colors of blue there. And then you move away from that, you get the Eastern Plains that looks much more like Nebraska and Kansas. The Dakotas off to the east, and then off to the west, you've got the mountains. And then it actually goes kind of back out into more of a desert as you go to the west. And so again, at the state level, I might say, okay, well, yeah, it's definitely where I live. The county I live in is definitely not urban. So it's not that dark blue, but it's that lighter shade of blue or getting into the green colors. So now this is the county I live in. This happens to be Eagle County, Colorado. And if you look at the map, actually, I'm going to back up one. So look at that, find that spot right there, back up. That is actually an urban population of 20,000 or more, an urban population by county of 20,000 or more. This is my county. If you look at the topo map of my county, Interstate 70 cuts straight through Eagle County. 80% of the lands are state or federally owned, BLM, national forest, state land, and there's very few little towns across that, basically that I-70 corridor, and then off to the south for the state highways in the southwest corner. Yet we are considered an urban county when you look at any of these national databases, because we've got that population of over 20,000 in our county itself. Even though no town is larger than in Eagle County, no town is larger than 6,000 population, oftentimes bedroom communities serving the recreation areas. If there is a fire, if there is a mudslide, if there is a flood, we're pretty trapped where we live. The last 2 years, 2020, we had a major fire in Glenwood Canyon. If you've ever driven through Glenwood Canyon between Glenwood Springs and Eagle, Colorado. Interstate was closed for 3 weeks because of a fire on the north and the south side of a canyon. The following year, August of 2021, rain came through, mudslides came down. That interstate was closed for another 3 weeks. And you could not get from actually one side of the county to the other because the alternate route to the interstate is an unpaved road. It's a county road that's unpaved. And so we talk about rural, and it is an interstate, right? So we had lots of high-level people coming in and being like, when are you guys gonna get that interstate open? And it's like, well, there's a mudslide, there's bridge damage. We had to come in and make sure that that it was safe for people to travel through, but no alternate routes. And that can be a challenge when you look at rural areas. And that's why there's a lot of closures in right now with what we're dealing with in Yellowstone, because there's not a lot of alternate routes, and it's seasonal alternate routes. Our alternate route in the summer is that dirt road, it's a county road. In the winter, there's no alternate routes because of the snow and because of the conditions. And so we need to look at other opportunities for us to make sure, whether it's structures or it's infrastructure or it's geotech or it's this climate change and things that are going on, how that affects us, our ability to be safe from a roadway perspective, but how we are safe if there was some sort of emergency or natural disaster. And you could take a scenario like this and move it to the East Coast, like North Carolina, where a hurricane maybe came through. Jamie talked about Vermont. There's a lot of different areas across this country that the challenges are very unique when it comes to rural. And so we need technology. We need different things to help us make sure that rural areas can be safe. So what we need good data, but we need accurate data when we're making decisions about rural areas. This is a map now from the National Association of County Officials. And this is the National Association of County Engineers is actually a really kind of a subsidiary of the National Association of County Officials, which tend to be elected officials. So this is a map that actually is showing the share of road miles owned by county highway agencies, right? So not just DOTs, but the county roads. So in the case of Iowa, there's actually 99 counties in Iowa, and most of the road miles in almost every single county in the state of Iowa are owned by local jurisdictions. We heard the previous panel talk about tribes. Ron had a great list up there in terms of less resources. Oftentimes that now you don't always have the technical expertise sometimes on the staff. There's a lot to do. You're wearing a lot of hats when you are a local or tribal agency employee. And so the challenges are that much more significant. So I've shown you like 4 different maps here. They're all showing something a little bit different, but they all can be surrogates to really help us really understand rural better and understand our goals as it relates to safety. Which brings me to NHTSA, the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration, FARS data. So this is the fatality data. This is looking at 2016 to 2020. If you haven't been on NHTSA's FARS data recently, they do have now a decent mapping tool where we can again look at what our data. Now it gets a little bit cloudy, if you will, off to the east because of the size of the dots there. But I'm gonna say, let's take a look at Montana. So this is looking at over there, you can see the different colors relate to the number of fatalities by year from the 2016 to 2020 data. You can oftentimes pick out certain roadway types by functional class in terms of the traveled ways, because typically the more traffic we have, oftentimes it increases the probability that you may have a crash. And so there's a lot of information here that I'm hoping that you all are using, or if whether it's your students or it's your own institutes, in terms of informing us, but then making sure you're looking at it at the right level of detail. Last but not least, we're gonna attempt, Tracy and I are gonna hopefully work this out here. I wanna show you Georgia DOT. I happen to be working with Georgia DOT over the last 5 years on development of local road safety plans, which is a proven safety countermeasure. Georgia DOT now uses Numetric as their crash data dashboard. There are other states that are utilizing this tool, have developed their own tools and dashboards. Getting local agency, anyone that touches, owns, operates, spends money on a roadway, giving them access to the data is so important. Idaho uses the same software. So what you can see here is I've drilled down on rural versus urban. Now, Tracy, with your permission, I'm going to jump out of this and I'm going to cross my fingers that, all right, so here we go. So what I did here is, let's see if I can come down. Not sure why. Let's make this a little smaller. You guys can see a little bit more. So what I have the ability to do in this dashboard is, first of all, what I can do is there's a toggle between rural and urban. So there's already been coded in there, rural versus, so immediately I'm going to drop the urban and I'm going to go right to rural. So that's why you've got the big void where Atlanta is. That makes sense, right? So that's my quick check. I want to look at years 2017 to 2021 because Georgia TOT does have, they validated the data from 2017 to 2021. And this is all crash data, not just fatalities, like I showed with the NHTSA data. I'm also, so what I did is on the CABCO scale, so KABCO, O being property damage only, I excluded all the property damage only crashes out of the system. Now I'm looking at only injury crashes. All right. And I chose for this example here, I chose to look at the K, A, B, and C. So now you can see again, rural, I've got data for 5 years. I'm going to look at just injury data. And now I'm going to look at functional class. In this case, I chose to do functional class. I got rid of the interstate, right? So there could be interstate and rural, but I don't want to look at the interstate at all. I just want to look specifically at what is non-interstate. So the next filter I am going to put in there, if I can, I'm going to put in a boundary. This is a public facing website. This is the other amazing thing is we have a lot more jurisdictions, a lot more agencies that are not only keeping this data to them, they're making it public. Anyone can jump on this. You guys can jump on it right now and you could actually do something similar. So I want to look at, let's see, I'm going to go actually to county. So let's just say I wanted to look at the county. So GDOT county boundaries. Oops. Let's see. I'm going to go to, that didn't work. Click the right button here. There we go. And I want to go to, let's just say I want to go to a minor collector. And is that going to pop up? Now this is where I think it's going to fight with me here. But anywhere in this, now if I like, let's just say I worked for Whitfield County. Whitfield County is in the northwest corner. I could go in just to Whitfield County. I could look at only the county system. I could look at the city and the county system. I could look at city, county, and state. So the power of the data, which then can become information for decision-making, is crucial. It's critical. And this is one thing that when we not only have good data, but we share good data with all decision makers, whether it's elected officials, it's people who own and operate the roadways, we can get better results faster. Okay, and so this is something that is super powerful. I'm going to go back to the PowerPoint right here. I just wanted to share that because there's a lot more states that are sharing their data publicly. And it's not just the fatalities like we can get in FARs. Okay, that's good to have that. But it's if you can go right to the source and have that available, it's available for all decision makers. You can tell a story with that data. So let's talk a little bit more about how we're going to help. So data is a really important piece, and using surrogates to crash data, surrogates to rural, surrogates to safety can be important. But it's also at the end of the day, it's how are we implementing that good information, that good data, and at Federal Highway Administration, for those of you that have worked with them in the Office of Safety, we work really hard at the deployment, that shovel-ready information on whether it's a solution or it's a strategy or it's a practice become really, really important, especially now with kind of the changes in some of the funding that we have going on. And then communicating that, right? So me communicating something is different than Jamie mentioned that the center, the Rural Road Safety Center, now has someone who's a specialist in marketing. There's a reason I am a specialist in engineering. Yes, I can communicate, but guess what? I want someone who majored in communication to help me communicate how we're going to make our roads safer. So I think Federal Highways has done a good job of coming out with more informative information that is relevant to more people, whether it's a kid in a classroom or it is an older driver, about why we do what we do. Well, roundabouts on rural roads reduce speeds, all speeds between 15 and 25 miles per hour, and it reduces severe injury crashes by 88%. Okay, and it's putting that out on social media, and it's having handouts at a public meeting. So it's thinking about, and you know what that started with? That started with research on rural roundabouts in the 1990s. Okay, and so, but unless we get that research and that information out there to people who are making decisions and the public, we have not succeeded. And so still today, even though research has been done for 25 years on roundabouts, we still have a lot of communities that don't like them and do not implement them. But they reduce fatal and injury crashes by 88%. So there's a lot of proven safety countermeasures. If you're not aware, Federal Highways has 8 more new or revised proven safety countermeasures out there. Off to the right, I put some of the more specific ones related to rural in the roadway departure, intersection, cross-cutting areas, which include local road safety plans, and even peds and bikes. Because even though we're rural, it doesn't mean that people aren't in a little town trying to cross the road. It's really important to think about those crosswalks or a rectangular rapid flashing beacon. Even if as you drive out of here, you know that people, like a hotel might be on this side, but maybe rafting's on the other side. They're going to cross that roadway, and how are we making sure that they do it safely? And last but not least, I'm just going to mention again the local road safety plan efforts that we have ongoing in many of the states across the country, where we are trying to get more proven safety countermeasures deployed. Again, there's the reason these are all proven safety countermeasures is because research was done to show that they reduce fatal and injury crashes. And so it's deploying those. It's going that extra mile to think about the implementation when we're doing the research to get all of these deployed. I have included numerous things out here. So rural roadway departure research is now a trading cards, all right? So think about how we're gonna get your research into something that we can share. It's having a nice infographic, flyer. We've got pictures, we've got statistics. How are we communicating the effectiveness of our roadway? Again, using different types of communication to basically connect with all people that are using our roadways, whether it's someone who doesn't drive, someone who's making a decision, and then using plain language to communicate the benefits of our research in safety and all transportation to make sure it does get implemented as widespread as possible. And last but not least, I'm sure most of you are aware, and we've heard Bill mentioned a couple of times, the bipartisan infrastructure law. There is new funding, brand new funding available, Safe Streets and Roads for All, otherwise known as SS4A grant program. There's a series of webinars going on. There'll be another one tomorrow. There was one yesterday and another one on the 23rd on how local agencies as direct recipients of federal funds can create safety action plans and implement safety directly on the roadways as direct recipients. David talked about this a little bit. There are opportunities for others to help local agencies do this. You can't apply for the funding for them, but we all know that not all local agencies and tribal entities are created equal. Oftentimes they do need that partnership, that collaboration to help them, again, be successful in these grant opportunities that have never existed before. So I'm going to end on that slide. And just again, a quick summary with just thinking about, again, in this case, rural is different than urban. And just because a map says that it's urban does not mean it's necessarily urban. And so the needs and the solutions might look slightly different. We don't always have the same resources. The safety culture of a community, Jamie touched on that little as well. That is very important in that engagement. We had some conversations and some questions regarding the tribes with that is understanding and collaborating, and then deploying, in this case, possible in rural environments, and they ultimately all are very critical to getting to zero. So I want you all to have a happy and a safe and a healthy visit here in Montana. And I think we're going to take some questions a little bit later. So thank you. Rob?
Thanks. I appreciate the opportunity to come up from campus and give a presentation today about really something that's primarily a rural issue, which is animal vehicle collisions. And so we have done some recent a pooled fund study, and we have some recent results I'd like to share with you today. And let me see where am I at. I want to make sure. So I want to review a little bit on the AVCs, the effectiveness of mitigation measures. There are over 30 that we've reviewed. And then also a big issue in rural areas are we often have public lands where the ecological connectivity, the road going through the habitat is an issue, and it's been incorporated in the recent passage of the Infrastructure Act. There's 4 or 5 provisions for maintaining habitat connectivity in various federal programs. So most of these wildlife vehicle collisions are, of course, single vehicle crashes. They occur primarily on 2-lane highways, which isn't surprising. Often high traffic roads become barriers for wildlife movement, and therefore they don't even attempt to cross those roads. And so primarily it is a 2-lane highway issue. It's low volume roads. Again, this is a rural road issue. They interestingly enough occur more frequently on straight. So it's really the random crossing of animals that causes the collisions. This was from the national study that the WTI road ecology team did back in '07. The new act is requiring it to be updated. So we should see after 15 years, we're going to have a whole new national study. Hopefully, I think FHWA might be doing it itself instead of opening it up to a competitive bid. Some of the other statistics: over 1 to 2 million collisions with large animals. Not so much is it a fatality issue, but it's mostly severe injuries and a lot of damage. So a lot of vehicles are disabled or cause a lot of repairs. So and the other thing is that we have over 22 threatened and endangered species where the listing decision was actually due to road mortality. And this again will be updated in the next couple of years. And all those numbers are sort of gaudy, millions and $8 billion in damage and costs. And this is underreported right now. So we've looked at various studies that have looked at the crash data sets that departments of transportation use, and then gone out and done field studies and then compared the differences. And so you can see from British Columbia to Virginia to the United Kingdom, we see really high levels of underreporting, not showing up in the database, both large animals and small animals. So the problem's much more severe than what our national databases are indicating. And the other thing about AVCs, so an animal vehicle collision is wildlife or domestic large livestock. So when I say AVCs, I'm including both wildlife and domestic animals. They often, the problem with rural crashes is the disabling of cars. I mean, often here in Montana, you might have to go 20, 30, 50 miles to have repairs. Same with medical services. So there's a disproportionate hardship when AVCs occur to rural communities or people, rural families have to, it's much more, there's no bus service. So how do you get to work when your car's disabled? If it takes 2 weeks to get a repair. So you can see that AVCs have a differing effect than crashes with vehicles in urban and suburban areas. The other thing is that when it comes to livestock collisions, often people will hit livestock and not report it, or it doesn't hurt the vehicle enough. And so there's, again, the livestock producers suffer from those losses. And they also are required to maintain the fence. Often the DOTs build the fence with consultation of the landowner. So it's the appropriate fence for the livestock that are on the private lands adjacent to the right of way. But then the maintenance often falls on the producer and for any breaches or when their animals get loose. So again, this is primarily a rural issue where often it's very different than crashes with in urban and suburban areas. And so this was the International Pooled Fund study that we just finished, and I'll be talking mostly about the results of the lit review of the mitigation measures for reducing animal vehicle collisions. The other thing is our UTC CertCom at WTI also matched a couple of our research studies from this pooled fund. So for example, we did a wildlife overpass using fiber reinforced polymer bridge structure. So instead of concrete and steel, we're trying this new type of material. And we're also looking at it in use for pedestrian crossings and bicycle crossings as well. So there's a way to, the UTC has been part of a few of the pooled fund study projects. And so when we look at, we reviewed the mitigation measures, we think of it as primarily 3 strategies. One is to influence driver behavior. One is to influence animal behavior near the road or the animal population size. And then the other one is to just separate vehicles from animals. And so we reviewed all 3 strategies with the different measures. And we looked at how effective they were at reducing the collisions. And so I'll first go to the influencing driver behavior. And as we know, we've spent a lot of resources to try to influence driver behavior, whether it's drunk driving or texting and driving. So you can imagine this strategy for a way to reduce animal vehicle collisions is equally challenging. And when we reviewed it, most of the measures are very ineffective. So if you look at the first column, that's the actual mitigation measure. The second column was how effective it is in reducing animal vehicle collisions. And the third column is how that particular mitigation measure improves or maintains the connectivity or wildlife movement across the road. And so as you can see, most, only 2 were the green are 75% to 100% effective, 50% to 75% are the yellow. The white are ones that we couldn't find any information or reliable studies to indicate how effective the measure was. And I'll show you a few of these examples from this, but you'll see that animal detection systems that then turn lights on that warn drivers tend to be effective. You'll see it's low at 33% and up to 97%. So a lot of it is the nuance of the location. And then the other one is seasonal closure. This would be more for like parks or refuges or areas where you have a mass migration of animals in a very short period of time. And so the other thing is we always see the standard signs, which don't work at all. The dynamic signs work a little bit better. And the best way to use signage is actually seasonally. So moving it in, putting it in place for maybe a month This again is more typical of Western migrations where elk and mule deer migrate. White deer in the east, not so much. But even sometimes it's like salamanders in Vermont crossing the road, and they do road closures there, for example. So, or put signs up to warn drivers. So, but again, it's only 9 to 50%, so it's not highly effective. The other one are these animal detection systems, and they are quite effective. If you try to use and these are where you put beams, shoot beams along the road, and when an animal breaks the beam or is detected by microwave or infrared, it'll flip the lights on to warn the drivers there's an animal on the road. And one of the biggest studies, 12 states joined in, was right here on 191 in Yellowstone. That's the picture there of that particular system. And so these are the different types that the systems use, and they've been deployed around the country. And those same systems are now moved off the roadside and are being put on board in vehicles. The problem with the research on how these smart vehicles using these different systems, I mean, they're going to have autonomous vehicles are going to have to detect pedestrians, bicyclists, so you can imagine a large warm-blooded animal would also be detected. But the research on this has only looked at how well they detect animals, not how effective they are in reducing collisions. So this is very promising, but we didn't have very good results for this particular report. But if you want your own and you have an older car, there's actually systems you can buy, place the detector up on your bumper, cable it in, and put the screen on your dashboard. So this uses an infrared system, the one I have here. So again, it's promising, but we still don't know how well it works. And then the other one that has some success is addressing heavy vegetation along the roads. Again, it gives the driver more time to react if an animal is approaching the road. And so if you clear that vegetation away, it allows drivers to hopefully slow down and avoid the collisions. Another thing that does work also is a roadway lighting. So nighttime, you're coming up on animals that are popping across, rapidly crossing the road. And so night lights actually do work. Now, we can't light our highways everywhere. So these are studies where there happen to be lighting at the lighting wasn't primarily developed to reduce animal vehicle collisions. So the problem, another idea about this night lighting, again, this is where you just put $2 reflective ear tags on cattle. We proposed this in the pooled fund study and it wasn't accepted, but we still think this might be a legitimate and very inexpensive solution for nighttime collisions with livestock. And then the other idea is to slow vehicles down, again, to give drivers more time to react to animals on the road. There was a study in Wyoming, and it found that even with law enforcement in these areas where they required 65 miles be reduced to 55 miles, a study of 2 years found that it didn't reduce animal vehicle collisions at all. And the reason, the problem at nighttime with our headlights is that the standard required headlights, if you look at the regs for a low beam, it's 150 to 200 feet. And for high beam, it's 250 to 350 feet. And then you look at reaction time at different speeds. These are nighttime speeds. If you're on low beam, you're overdriving your lights all the time. We have a real structural problem with our headlights, and we've never fixed it, which is quite surprising that we haven't thought about maybe making standards that allow us drivers to react once they see an animal on the road. So, and then the other one that's quite effective is traffic calming. Again, you'll see this in protected areas like parks and refuges where you can actually put speed bumps. It's will never occur on our highway system, but it will on lower volume roads, and they're quite effective. And they also allow small animals to get safely across as well. And then we try to influence animal behavior. This happens to be a fence-in treatment where deer and elk were fenced off the road. There's a crossing, but at the far end of the fence, they put boulders, and they thought that ungulates or hoofed animals wouldn't want to walk across a boulder field. So this was an attempt, and again, it hasn't been very well studied how effective boulder fields are. And you can see it's behind the guardrail because you don't want vehicles driving into boulder fields. It becomes a safety issue for motorists. So when we looked at influencing animal behavior, it's even more difficult than influencing human behavior. You'll see a lot of the measures have been attempted, but no one has studied them. So all those white boxes, from de-icing alternatives to salt to hazing animals, we don't know how effective they are. And what has worked is wildlife culling. And what that is white-tailed deer, many suburban areas where they have high populations. They want to reduce the herds, not only for safety reasons on the highway, but the benefit is when you cull the herds, reduce the population of local herds, you get a reduction in animal vehicle collisions as well. And then some of the yellow ones like relocation or anti-fertility, again, it's trying to remove the animals from the where there are high, they tend to, for example, bighorn sheep are known where they winter right along the road. And that's where you would want to either have a treatment like, that's where the olfactory repellent, you would spray along the road to keep them from trying to get to the salt on the road. So there are sometimes it's partially effective, not at the 75 or to 100%. This is a very common, you'll see reflectors all the time. This was again another study that WYDOT supported, Wyoming DOT, and they actually found that even though it's reported to reduce wildlife vehicle collisions, when they did a 2-year study, they found that in fact it's quite low, only 32% reduction. And the picture on the right was they put white bags to cover the reflectors, and they actually found the white bags reduced collisions more than the reflectors. So this is not good news for the company that makes this particular product. And as I mentioned earlier, this is the kind of where you put it into water and spray it along the road to drive ungulates away. It usually has a scent similar to carnivores or predators. And as I mentioned earlier, this is relatively effective, but it can only be used in particular areas where it makes sense for other purposes as well. And this is it's effective, but it's very expensive. So again, probably not going to be a common practice or widely applicable. And then the last strategy is to separate animals from the road. And that means fencing our roads. And it's very effective, 80 to 100%. But if you just fence, then you lose all that ecological connectivity, you the movement of not only your target species, such as say deer, elk, and moose, but all your medium and smaller sized animals can't get across the road either. So although effective, what you usually want to do is build a crossing with that fencing. Everyone always thinks it's a crossing that reduces the wildlife vehicle collisions. It's the fencing that reduces the collisions. It's the crossing that keeps the ecological connectivity intact. So you can see on these, Both just fences alone are very effective. Fences with the crossing structures are very effective. And just building the crossing structure all by itself, and if you can locate it in the absolute proper place, it can be effective. But if not, they find that the animals won't go to use the structures. So again, that's why I've always made the point is to use that fencing to direct the animals to the structures as well as keep them off the road. And as a result of these findings, and this is now the standard practice all across the world, not just North America, but in the new Infrastructure Act, there's a $350 million program for wildlife crossings. So we're going to see this increase, this particular practice, especially at the most problematic sites. And it'll be a competitive grant program, about 60 million, I think, in the first year, which will hope, I have heard they'll roll it out, FHWA will roll it out in the fall. So we'll probably see a lot more of the crossing structures. And again, they also they're well studied for over 30 years now, and many other species, your target species, the large animals, if you build it for them, you can also get all the other species. Some structures will have water, little ponds, so that amphibians can use the crossings as well. So you can design them for many different species besides the ones that are a safety issue. So there are, again, 30 different mitigation measures. As you saw, many don't work, and yet they're common practice. And so we are hoping, again, as we take these findings out, that we'll be able to have our investments in reducing ABCs use those measures that are proven effective. And then also some that are promising, we really need to better understand how effective they are as well. Thank you.
All right, well, thank you to our panel. Time for some questions. We'll have the mics out here. So.
Yeah. Mehdi Madi and Virginia Tech, great presentations by all three panelists. The question that I have for all three of you is, how does the introduction of autonomous passenger cars or semi-autonomous passenger cars and trucks that are on the horizon will be complicating the already complicated issue that you guys are dealing with?
I'll start. So autonomous vehicles, right? Semi-autonomous or autonomous. Okay, so I'd say I'm going to start with, for those of you who are maybe not as familiar with rural, the fleet in terms of what you see in a rural area versus what you might see in a suburban and urban area is very different. I will only use myself as an example here because that's the easiest to do. My fleet of vehicles is a 1983 Ford pickup truck, a 2002 Euro van, and a 2010 Subaru Outback. And I am where we live, that is not uncommon to have vehicles that are older that don't have that technology. And I think the best technology that you could have on those three vehicles that I mentioned is good tires, friction on your roadway. And so I think that you'll see in different, and again, specific to rural, you'll see that infiltration look different than you might see it in other parts of the country. Interestingly enough, I told you guys I live in Eagle County. Tesla is building actually a service center in our area because we are a big draw because we have a Costco. And you have to go to like 200, I'd say 150 miles radius around our county. There's nothing really. And so they actually, it's one of their sites that they're actually going to have. So you're seeing more and more Tesla and other vehicles, and even the semi-autonomous in terms of a newer vehicle that are coming to the area. So right now, I think that as they trickle into the rural areas, you're going to see maybe there's clearly the vehicle to road, vehicle to infrastructure technology. There could be the vehicle to vehicle technology available. But then also, I think one of the most important things in the rural areas is there's places all over that there is no connectivity. So if it's a vehicle to vehicle, that might be more possible than something that's going to have to use a satellite or something to that effect, that is going to have to rely on everyone communicating to one source and then them communicating to each other. So I think the technology looks slightly different in the rural environment. And this is not my area of expertise. This is just conversations that we've had through the Rural Road Safety Center and in some of the communities that we work in, is just how it looks different and how it might come to the rural areas a little bit differently. But the vehicle to vehicle, I think, has more of a chance sooner in some of the rural areas than maybe necessarily the vehicle to, and the vehicle to infrastructure to some extent, depending on what type of facility that you are on, for like chips and signs or pavement marking, things like that. However, in the northern climates, we paint with markings once a year. So 9 months out of the year, there's no markings on the roadway. So those are some of the challenges that exist that I've observed in conversations that we have had with some of local agencies in particular, when it comes to autonomous and semi-autonomous vehicles. But again, I'm not the expert in that area. I'm fascinated by that. But I do think it looks very different in the rural environment.
And I agree. I think it's going to look different. And there are a lot of studies going on right now for how that's going to look both with transit. And there was a recent study here in Yellowstone and one that happened at Wright Brothers with how that could possibly look. There's some going on with our colleagues here in the room at University of Iowa, some in Texas too, on rural and what that may or may not look like. But I know and I'll be very clear, I don't live in a rural area. I live in a suburban area. I just study rural. I have a second house in a very rural area, but we did own a Tesla for a while, and we recently got rid of it. And it worked well for some things and didn't work well for others in a suburban area. And when we would take it to our second house in our rural area, there were things it just couldn't do. It shut off a lot. And couldn't handle it. So it was very interesting for us to own a vehicle. My husband is a cybersecurity person, and then I do rural transportation safety. So we liked having the Tesla just to see from both of our aspects for work, how it would work and how it wouldn't. I think there are a lot of opportunities, though, if we can get it to work in a rural area. I think some of those things that we talked about with post-crash care and the notification and detection of crashes and trying to quicken up some of that might be able to be much quicker if we can get vehicle to work and be able to get some of that picked up more frequently. I talked a lot about the different types of vehicles on rural areas, such as the slow moving vehicles with the agriculture and the horse and buggy. And if we can get them to be able to be picked up quite like a pedestrian and bicyclist or an animal and make those crashes less would be fantastic as well. Because closing speeds for those vehicles are, you get to those slow moving vehicles so quickly, and the destruction is a lot because especially when they're not wearing seat belts, because their vehicles are not built for that. So if some of the automated braking could help with that, or the detection. So I do think there's a lot of opportunities as well.
Yeah, and I think for animal vehicle collisions, it's actually quite promising that the sensor systems on AVs, my understanding is there's a mix of types. So you have infrared, you have LiDAR, some are better in fog, some are better at night. And all those systems will be operative again to protect human life, pedestrians and and bicyclists. So I think adapting that for wildlife will be pretty straightforward. The downs, and I do want to point out, it might be 20 years for the fleet to be replaced, so we can't just stop with our other mitigation measures right away. And the last piece is the conservation, the environmental effects of the traffic. We still have to provide crossings for all the species because of the barrier effect of the roads. So even if we reduce the collisions with the big animals, we still have to get everything across. So there will still need to be infrastructure, but it might be placed different. A good example of that is right now, most all the structures are going where deer are having collisions. That isn't the necessarily most important place for, say, grizzly bears or bighorn sheep or all the other species. So the system's driven by safety right now. I think once the autonomous vehicles come on and we don't have to worry about the safety, the investments will be less, but they'll be more focused on conservation.
And Jen, did you have a question?
Jen Giuliano from USC. I had a much simpler question. And that was, I was fascinated about the headlight story, that we actually have headlights that don't see far enough so that we could stop in time anyway. And I'd like just to hear a little bit more about why that is. I mean, I'm assuming the light would be too bright for the oncoming traffic to be able to do that, but.
Yeah, I am not an engineer on headlight design, but clearly we see some of the new high-powered headlights, and they sort of hit us when we're driving. So I don't know how the engineers will work it out, but it just seems like we have to do something about our headlights. It just seems like, to me, it seems like a no-brainer, but we haven't really seen anyone advocate for that as a solution for nighttime accidents, even though we know the failings. So, but I think design issues have to be sorted out, and I'm not an expert on that. So.
And as Rob talked about too, using those infrared, again, for people in rural areas tend to hold on to their cars longer, as Hillary talked about. What you tend to see in rural areas is vastly different than urban areas as far as what the fleet looks like. And so retrofitting some of that technology, and we've seen, as we talked about the autonomous vehicles, you don't have to get to that fully autonomous, what we call the SAE levels 4 and 5. I mean, to say adaptive cruise control, automatic braking, some of those where, man, as the driver, you're still driving and hopefully paying attention. But as Hillary talked about, and Jamie, with the safe systems approach, to say humans make mistakes. So if I happen to not be paying attention at the moment, does it mean my car in cruise control is going to rear end someone, or the car senses that, hey, I might not be paying attention, so it's going to slow down and keep me from hitting that car? So while not fully autonomous, those safety improvements really help improve safety. So I apologize, I'm going to have to leave it there because we don't want to stand between you and your lunch. And as we talked about the power of partnership, I want to thank Florida Atlantic University for sponsoring lunch.